My name is Miller Files. In my line of work, I have learned something that most people never do. The most frightening crimes are not the loud ones. They are not announced by gunshots or sirens or chaos. They begin quietly, sometimes with a decision, sometimes with a door opening, sometimes with a man walking into a bar on a Friday night, expecting nothing more than a drink and a distraction. That man was Brian Shaffer. On March 31st, 2006, Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He was a medical student at Ohio State University. He was intelligent, reserved, and by all accounts, deeply human. He had just lost his mother to cancer, a loss that rearranges a person's inner world in ways no textbook can explain. But loss does not automatically create disappearance. Brian was still showing up to class, still talking about the future, still planning trips with friends, still in love. There was nothing in his life that suggested he was preparing to vanish. That is what makes this case dangerous, because when people disappear without warning, investigators often look for hidden motives, secret plans, double lives. But Brian Shaffer did not live like a man with an exit strategy. He lived like a man trying to keep going. That Friday night, Brian went out with friends to unwind. The destination was a bar called Ugly Tuna Saloon, located on the second floor of the Gateway Complex in Columbus, Ohio. It was a familiar place. Popular with students, loud, crowded. The kind of place where no one is watching anyone closely. Security cameras recorded Brian entering the bar shortly before midnight. The footage is clear. He is calm, unrushed, not stumbling, not arguing. Just another face in a sea of faces. Inside the bar, witnesses later recalled Brian talking with friends, laughing, and at one point speaking with two women he did not arrive with. Nothing about his behavior raised concern. This is an important detail, because whatever happened to Brian Shaffer did not begin with a visible conflict. There was no fight, no dramatic moment, no reason for anyone to remember him as the man who would soon disappear. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Brian's friends decided to leave. They assumed Brian had gone home with someone else or would follow shortly. This is not negligence. This is not abandonment. It is the kind of assumption people make every weekend in every college town in America. That assumption would become permanent. Brian Shaffer was never seen again. When his friends realized he had not come home, they initially believed there had been a misunderstanding, a missed ride, a forgotten phone call. But hours turned into days, days turned into questions, and questions turned into one of the most confounding missing person cases in modern American history. Because when police began reviewing the security footage, they found something that should not have been possible. Brian Shaffer entered the bar, and he never came out, not on camera, not on any angle, not on any recording, in a building with limited exits, in a crowded space. Under surveillance, the footage showed everyone else leaving, except Brian. At that moment, this case stopped being ordinary. It became something else entirely. A disappearance that did not fit the rules investigators rely on. A man who vanished not in the wilderness, not in isolation, but in the middle of a city surrounded by people. In the next part of this investigation, I will walk through the physical space of Ugly Tuna Saloon itself, the doors, the staircases, the blind spots, because sometimes the truth is not hidden in a person's psychology. Sometimes it is hidden in architecture, and sometimes all it takes is a few missing seconds to erase a human being from the record. When investigators fail to find answers in people, They turn to places buildings do not lie. Walls do not forget. Architecture records movement in ways memory cannot. That is why the second phase of the Brian Shaffer investigation did not begin with interviews. It began with measurements. Ugly Tuna Saloon was not a maze. It was not a sprawling nightclub with endless exits. It was a bar on the second floor of a commercial complex built for efficiency, not mystery. From the moment police realized Brian had not appeared on any exit camera, they focused on a single question. How does a man leave a place that appears to leave no room for disappearance? The bar had one main public entrance. That entrance was covered by a camera positioned at the top of an escalator. Anyone leaving the bar was expected to pass through that frame. There was also a stairwell. That stairwell was monitored. Investigators reviewed hours of footage. They slowed it down. They watched frame by frame. Brian never appeared. This was not a technical error. The cameras were working. Other patrons were recorded leaving throughout the night. Just not him. When a disappearance violates physical logic, investigators begin searching for exceptions. Employee-only areas, service, corridors, maintenance doors. Ugly Tuna Saloon did have internal access points, doors not intended for customers, routes known primarily to staff. Police interviewed employees, bartenders, security, cleaning crews. No one recalled seeing Brian leave through a restricted area. No one reported escorting him out. No one remembered anything unusual. This is where the case began to shift from puzzling to disturbing, because in most investigations, someone remembers something. A strange look, an argument, a man who seemed out of place. In this case, Brian Shaffer faded quietly. Investigators walked the building themselves. They traced paths. They stood where cameras stood. They discovered blind spots. Not many, but enough. A camera angle that missed a corner. A moment when a crowd blocked the view. A door partially obscured by bodies moving at the wrong time. This is the part of the story that is hardest to accept. Brian may have left the bar. He may have walked out like everyone else, and yet no one saw him do it. If that is true, then the real disappearance did not occur inside Ugly Tuna Saloon. It occurred after. Outside the bar, Columbus was still awake. Cars passed, students walked. Lights reflected off wet pavement. But once again, Brian vanished. No traffic camera recorded him. No ATM logged his card. No phone tower recorded his signal. It was as if the moment he exited that building, he stepped into a gap in reality. Investigators expanded the search area. Hospitals were checked. Jails were contacted. Shelters were notified. Nothing. Days passed, then weeks, and then something else happened. Brian Shaffer stopped being treated as a missing man. He became a question mark, because missing people usually create ripples. They touch systems. They appear somewhere. Brian did not. There were no financial movements, no medical records, no border crossings. The world behaved as though Brian Shaffer no longer existed. For investigators, this presents a terrifying possibility. Either Brian Shaffer died without leaving a trace, or he lived without leaving a footprint. Both outcomes are rare. Both demand extraordinary explanations. Some officers began to quietly believe that the answer lay in a narrow window of time. Seconds, not hours. A moment when cameras did not capture a face. A decision made under the influence of alcohol, a wrong turn. In criminal investigations, we are trained to believe that complexity creates mystery. But this case suggests the opposite, that sometimes mystery is created by something very small. A door opening briefly, a camera blinking, a man choosing left instead of right. By the time police realized how little they truly knew, the trail was already cold, and cold trails do not warm themselves. In the next part of this investigation, I will examine the human element, the friends, the witnesses, the people who were closest to Brian Shaffer, because buildings can hide exits, but people hide truths. When places stop talking, investigators turn to people, not because people are more reliable, but because people carry fragments that buildings cannot. In the Brian Shaffer case, those fragments were scattered across a crowded bar, a group of friends, and a handful of witnesses whose memories were shaped by alcohol, time, and uncertainty. The night Brian disappeared, he was not alone. That fact matters. He arrived at Ugly Tuna Saloona with friends he trusted, people who knew his habits, people who understood his moods. In the hours after Brian vanished, those friends would replay the night over and over, searching for something they missed. They remembered Brian smiling. They remembered him talking to two women near the bar. They remembered him saying he would catch up later. Nothing about those memories suggested danger. Investigators interviewed the friends separately. They compared timelines. They listened for contradictions. There were none that mattered. No argument, no tension, no plan. That ended badly. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in the case. Sometimes there is no warning. The two women Brian was seen speaking with became a focus early in the investigation, not because they were suspects, but because they were among the last people known to interact with him. Police tracked them down. They cooperated fully. They confirmed speaking with Brian. They confirmed leaving the bar without him. They did not know where he went. Their stories matched. Their behavior raised no red flags. Another lead closed quietly. As the investigation widened, police interviewed staff members again. They asked different questions. They pressed harder. Had anyone been removed from the bar? Had anyone been escorted out? Had anyone seemed unwell? The answers did not change. No one remembered Brian being thrown out. No one recalled him asking for help. No one saw him collapse or stumble. The absence of drama is what defines this case. In many disappearances, there is a moment of crisis, a fight, a scream, a scene that draws attention. Brian Shaffer disappeared without noise. Investigators began examining Brian's personal life more closely. They reviewed his phone records, his emails, his relationships. Brian had a girlfriend, a serious one. She was expecting him to call. He never did. She waited through the night. Through the next day, when she realized something was wrong, she contacted his friends. This detail matters because it establishes something critical. Brian had an anchor. People who plan to disappear often sever emotional ties first. They create distance. Brian did not. He left loose ends everywhere. His father believed Brian would not leave voluntarily. He knew his son's character. He knew his grief. And grief, while powerful, rarely erases a person's sense of responsibility to the people they love. As days turned into weeks, investigators faced a growing problem. Every person who should have noticed something unusual did not, and every person who might have seen something could not remember. Alcohol blurs memory. Crowds erase individuals. Brian was not invisible, but he became forgettable in the worst possible way. This led to a theory that many investigators resist, that Brian Shaffer may have left with someone who did not know him, someone who did not realize they were becoming the last witness. A ride offered casually, a conversation cut short, a decision made without consequence in mind. If that happened, then the disappearance moved beyond the bar and into the city. And once a person disappears into a city at night, surrounded by strangers, the odds shift dramatically. There is another possibility investigators considered, but rarely discuss openly. That Brian encountered someone who intended harm, not someone he knew, not someone connected to his life. A chance encounter. Crimes of opportunity leave very little behind. They happen fast. They leave no witnesses who recognize what they are seeing, and they are almost impossible to reconstruct after the fact. Yet even this theory struggled under scrutiny. There was no blood, no report of violence, no discovery of a body. The city gave nothing back. By the time investigators reached this stage, they were no longer asking what happened inside ugly tuna saloona. They were asking what happened in the space between people. The moments after Brian stepped away from the familiar, the seconds when he was alone, because in disappearances like this, the truth often lives in the gaps between memories. And those gaps only grow with time. In the next part of this investigation, I will examine the theories that followed, the explanations people reached for when evidence failed them. Because when answers do not exist, belief fills the void. When evidence runs out, theories rush in. I have seen this pattern repeat itself in case after case. When facts stop moving forward, imagination takes over, not because people want fantasy, but because the human mind cannot tolerate emptiness. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer created a vacuum, and into that vacuum came explanations that sounded convincing only because nothing else existed. The first theory to gain traction was voluntary disappearance. It is a theory investigators are trained to consider early. People do leave their lives behind. They change names. They start over. But this theory collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Brian Shaffer did not prepare to vanish. He did not empty bank accounts. He did not secure identification. He did not contact anyone after that night. He left behind tuition, belongings, relationships. People who disappear on purpose usually leave order behind. Brian left chaos. Another theory followed closely: suicide. It was fueled by one undeniable truth. Brian was grieving. His mother's death weighed heavily on him, and grief can distort judgment. But grief alone is not a conclusion. There was no note, no search history, no known location tied to self-harm, and most importantly, no body. Suicide without a body is rare. Suicide without a trace is almost unheard of. This theory explained pain, but it did not explain disappearance. As months passed, a darker theory began circulating: foul play. The idea that Brian encountered someone with violent intent, a stranger, a moment of opportunity. This theory fits many unsolved cases, but here it stumbled. There was no sign of struggle, no reports of violence near the bar that night. No witnesses describing a confrontation. Crimes of opportunity are messy. They leave something behind. This one left nothing? Then there was the theory people rarely say aloud, that Brian never truly left the building, that his body was concealed, that the bar itself held the secret. Investigators searched thoroughly: walls, ceilings, storage areas. Nothing. Buildings do not keep secrets well when they are dismantled. Ugly Tuna Saloona was later renovated, then demolished. Still, nothing was found. At that point, the investigation entered its most dangerous phase: speculation. People began filling the silence with extraordinary ideas: secret passages, organized crime, cover-ups, none supported by evidence. And yet these ideas spread faster than facts ever could. This is the moment when cases like this slip away from resolution, not because the truth is gone, but because it is buried under noise. Investigators returned again and again to the same conclusion. Whatever happened to Brian Shaffer occurred in a narrow window of time, a span so small that it evaded cameras, so ordinary that it drew no attention, so brief that it left no mark. A wrong turn, a moment alone, an encounter that ended quickly. This is not a satisfying explanation, but it is the one that fits the evidence best. In my experience, the most unsettling cases are not the ones involving elaborate schemes. They are the ones shaped by chance. Randomness frightens us because it cannot be predicted or controlled. Brian Shaffer did not disappear because the world conspired against him. He disappeared because the world did not notice him at the exact moment it mattered. As years passed, leads dried up, witnesses moved on, memories faded. The case remained open, but it no longer moved. In the final part of this documentary, I will confront the question that remains after every file is closed and every theory exhausted. What does it mean when someone disappears without an answer? And what responsibility do we carry when a name becomes a mystery instead of a person? Every investigation ends the same way. Not with an answer, but with a moment when the question stopped producing new ground. The case of Brian Shaffer reached that moment quietly. There was no announcement, no official conclusion, no press conference declaring failure. The file simply stopped growing. In the years that followed Brian's disappearance, detectives revisited the evidence again and again. They re-watched the footage. They re-interviewed witnesses. They reopened doors that had already been closed. Nothing changed. The city moved on. New bars opened. Old buildings were renovated or erased. The ugly Tuna Saloona no longer exists. The space where Brian was last seen alive has been altered beyond recognition. This matters more than most people realize. Crime scenes are fragile. They depend on memory, context, and preservation. When a place changes, the truth loses another anchor. Brian's father never stopped looking. He carried his son's face into every year that passed without answers. For families of the missing, time does not heal. It stretches the wound. Every unknown call becomes a possibility. Every unidentified body becomes a question. Brian's case never offered closure, only endurance. As an investigator, I am often asked what I believe happened. Belief is not evidence, and in this case, evidence refuses to choose a side. But I know this: Brian Shaffer did not vanish into myth. He did not dissolve into rumor. He was a real person who existed in a real place, at a real moment in time. And something happened to him. The most uncomfortable truth in criminal investigation is that some cases are not unsolved because the truth is complex. They are unsolved because the truth is ordinary. A decision made without foresight, a meeting without significance until later, a moment that did not look important when it happened. In a crowded city, it is possible to disappear without intention, not because you are hiding, but because no one is looking. Brian Shaffer was not erased by conspiracy. He was erased by silence. Silence from witnesses who did not know what they were seeing. Silence from cameras that blinked at the wrong time. Silence from a city that did not realize it had lost someone. When I close this file, I do so without resolution, but not without responsibility. The responsibility to remember that behind every mystery is a human life interrupted. Brian was not a story. He was a son, a student, a friend, and until there is proof otherwise, he remains missing. Not gone, not forgotten, just unanswered. This is Miller Files, and this case remains open.